Pac-Man Championship Edition 2, released in 2016 for various platforms, but we're playing this on PC via Steam, is the sequel to Pac-Man Championship Edition. It follows a similar playstyle to the previous game, but it also does its own little twist on the formula to somewhat justify its existence. And I'll be honest, I was skeptical about this one because Championship Edition DX Plus was a wonderful little game with plenty of replay value that a sequel seemed somewhat unnecessary. Eventually, I bit the bullet, gave the sequel a shot when it was on special, and decided to stick with DX Plus instead because I thought that was a better game. So with that reaction, does that make Pac-Man Championship Edition 2 a bad game or a bad sequel? The short answer is no, of course not. The long answer is the rest of this video. So for those unfamiliar with the Pac-Man Championship Edition series, the premise goes like this. You eat dots on the screen, a fruit appears, you eat the fruit and the maze transforms and adds more dots for you to eat, or rather you transition to a new maze in this version. And you continue to do this while avoiding ghosts within the time limit. It's taking the simple concept of Pac-Man and giving it an acid trip, so to speak. Championship Edition 2 tweaks the formula somewhat so that instead of eating all the dots in a maze, you eat just enough to fill a meter that makes the fruit appear, so you don't have to eat all the dots on a maze. As soon as the fruit appears, you can just grab it right away and you move on straight to the next maze. But if you do eat all the dots on a maze, you'll get some bombs. Sometimes instead of fruit, you'll eat dots to make power pellets appear that will allow you to gobble up the ghost trains for big points, which you'll have to pursue since you're stuck on train tracks and such. Okay, so Championship Edition DX introduced the concept of ghost trains that will chase you down as you're blazing through this, and as you pass by sleeping ghosts, they'll wake up and join the train that passes by, and making that chain longer so that when you eat them up, you get big points and that sort of thing. Championship Edition 2 takes this a bit further, I guess. You still have the ghost trains chasing you, but there will also be multiple trains, and unlike before, touching a ghost train won't kill you, you'll just bump into them. Bump into them enough times and they'll turn into a super ghost that can kill you unless you outrun said ghost after a while, which will turn back to the ghost train thing. You don't have a slow-mo feature to save your ass when you're near a ghost or whatever, but you do have a brake button that stops Pac-Man in his tracks. The brake button is such a useful feature in gameplay to the point where I practically forget that it's a thing to break Pac-Man. Okay, that probably sounded... never mind. Championship Edition 2 starts you off with a tutorial mode which teaches you how to play the game, and once you're done with that, you get to play the game's two other modes, Adventure and Score Attack. The Adventure mode is where you tackle a number of specific challenges, including boss battles, mostly micro time trial things where you have a specific goal to achieve. And Score Attack is the usual timed challenges where you're vying for a top score within 5 or 10 minutes or whatever the case may be, and that sort of thing. Adventure mode is more like those micro time trial things. You earn stars and you unlock stuff. And it's nothing really special. Quite frankly, not something I touch all that often, especially when the Score Attack mode does all I need for that sort of game. And the game does sport multiple mazes for you to tackle, some of which have been taken from the previous Champion Edition game, but there's a couple new ones in there as well. And I'm going to be honest with you, Pac-Man Champion Edition 2 doesn't really do much for me. Don't get me wrong, it's still a pretty fun little arcade-style game, much in the same vein as the previous Champion Edition entry. More than enough little changes made and tweaks made here and there to make it somewhat distinct from the previous game, to sort of justify its existence. Lots of mazes, lots of options, lots of little challenges. The replay value invariably is going to be up there for those who want it. Controls just as well as the previous game for whatever that's worth. So it's a solid game overall. It just isn't for me. I really don't care for the ghost bumping thing, and mind you, the slow-mo feature in DX also took a bit of the edge off by giving you a bit of an escape opportunity with those near-death encounters, but at the very least, if you touched a ghost there, you died. Here, bumping into ghosts to make them angry and then they try to kill you, and I don't know, something, I also miss the transformative aspect of the fruit. The effect of eating a fruit transforming one side of the maze into another form will always be a cooler visual than simply jumping onto another board. Bombs have also been altered in that instead of clearing the boards of ghosts like they did in the previous game, It merely transports Pac-Man back to his safe zone, which is exactly what a bomb should do, is transport things, not blow them up or clear them away. And instead of earning extra lives after scoring enough points, they'll simply appear on the maze somewhere and you have to grab them. And I always hate that because more often than not, they'll appear someone on a maze, but I'll forget about them and move on to another maze because it goes against how lives are gained in these sort of Pac-Man games, which is score big points and you get an extra life right off the bat. And look, these are just quibbles I have with Championship Edition 2, and really, this is a case where your mileage varies, and again, I'm not calling this a bad game. You know, I've had some enjoyment out of it. I'm not going to say they ruined anything. They had to do something different to make it distinct from the previous game to sort of justify its existence, and for the most part, it's a perfectly fine game, but I just like the previous game better, and that's fine. It's okay that this doesn't hit the mark for me, but it may for you. Much like the previous game, Pac-Man Championship Edition 2 sports multiple visual styles, all of which feature lots of flashing lights, psychedelic backdrops, and visual effects, and plenty of acid trips without the need for recreational drugs, though I'd imagine those wouldn't help much here. Basically, it's similar to the other Championship Edition visually, but now when you eat the train, it's in 3D and it's amazing and whatnot. And if the plain Jane overhead doesn't work for you or is a tad boring, can't imagine why, you can skew the perspective somewhat so it looks you're looking at it from an angle, which makes for an interesting visual if nothing else, sort of giving it that old school Pac-Mania vibe. I'm sure there's some new styles and the skewed camera angles might make for some exciting visual styles, I guess. But honestly, they all look the same to me, and it really doesn't change the other visual effects that the game throws at you, which is lots of flashy colors and such. Ditto with the soundtrack, which may or may not be recycled bits from the previous game. I'm sure there's a couple of new tracks in there. Honestly, to tell you the truth, the soundtrack for these Championship Edition games often blend together. Some techno beats and chiptune stuff that has some Pac-Man themes in them, I guess, but nothing that really sticks to mind because you're focused on the gameplay and what's happening on screen. I'm sure for some people this has some great music, but they've got enough techno tunes and stuff, and it's just, I don't know, it's just recycled background noise to me, so no real comment there. Sound effects are definitely recycled from the previous game, which in turn is based on sounds from the old arcade games, so that's something, I suppose. Overall, Pac-Man Championship Edition 2 is a perfectly fine follow-up to Championship Edition DX, although again I will say that I prefer DX over this, as I felt like a much cleaner, somewhat smoother experience that number 2 doesn't quite reach. It's still somewhat fast-paced, enjoyable fare, but not something I'd go back to often, as again I didn't care for the ghost bumping aspect and trains and such. Some of the changes simply didn't sit well with me, especially after a game that was just fine as it was. However, again, your mileage may vary in this regard, and if you enjoyed the previous Pac-Man Championship Edition game, then chances are you might enjoy this second iteration a little more than I did. And if you haven't played the previous game and this looks like something up your alley, go for it and give it a shot. Why not?